Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the CHEQ Trends and Connections to the EDI webinar. My name is Mariana Brusoni. I'm a professor in the UBC Faculty of Medicine and an investigator in the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute and the director of the Human Early Learning Partnership. The Human Early Learning Partnership is a research center at the University of British Columbia that is dedicated to improving the health and well-being of children through interdisciplinary research and knowledge mobilization. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to let you know that closed captioning is available for this webinar. You can find a CC button at the bottom of your screen. If it's not there now, it should be available shortly. And you just click on that, you will be able to see the closed captioning. I want to begin by acknowledging on behalf of HELP that our work occurs on the campus of the University of British Columbia, which is traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. We take our responsibility to the First Nations peoples of BC very seriously and to heart as our work traverses many nations' territories. With that in mind, I want to introduce one of our elders as part of our Aboriginal Steering Committee, Elder Rihanna Erasmus. She's a longtime Aboriginal Steering Committee member who's graciously offered to provide a welcome for us for this event. Rihanna Erasmus is a member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation within Treaty 8 territory, with roots in the Hupachaset First Nation and Nechalneth people in Port Alberni, BC. Rihanna has been involved in First Nations education for over 50 years, from Aboriginal Head Start to post-secondary education. She's been involved with the Aboriginal Head Start program, urban and northern communities since its inception, both in the Northwest Territory and across Canada. Currently, she is the honorary elder for the Northwest Territories Aboriginal Head Start Council. Rihanna uses both current research in early childhood and her experiences in the work that she continues to do to promote community control of early childhood programs. Rihanna is also honored to be called the Elder of the HELP Aboriginal Steering Committee. A call came out for new members for the HELP ASC, and Rihanna put her name forward and was chosen to be part of HELP in 2016. Her interest to use research data to better improve First Nations outcomes in the education system and in early childhood development programs was the main reason that she wanted to be part of the Aboriginal Steering Committee. You can read more about Rihanna and the Aboriginal Steering Committee on our website, with the link will be in the chat. With that, let me turn it over to Rihanna.
Masi, Witsiskum, Hupachaset Aksup. I live on the unceded territory of the Hupachaset people, my home territory. And in our traditional way, I'll give you a shortened version of who I am. I am the eldest granddaughter of the hereditary chief Dan Watts and his partner Annie Watts, Jack. I am the oldest daughter of B. Sayers and Eric Sayers. And I have two beautiful children, grown. And I have worked with the HELP Aboriginal Steering Committee, as was said, since 2016. I'm very excited today for the presentation on the Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. I can remember when it first came out, there was a real excitement around the office in regards to being called CHEQ, because the CH not only stands for childhood It also stands for Clyde Hertzman, who was a revered leader within the HELP department. And it's exciting that the Aboriginal Steering Committee has spent time with the HELP partners and doing what we feel is important, that the questionnaires, the data that is gathered has the scope, the vision of not only the researchers, but also for the Aboriginal people. It's important that we have input into such things, because it's part of reconciliation. It's part of seeing our voices heard. It's part of us fighting against systemic racism, and to see our children as who they are, unlike when residential schools were still in play, that they weren't recognized as people. They were numbers. They were wards, as you say, for the church and the government. And so I always like to see any work that is done in HELP that reflects us as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So Mussy, welcome to the presentation today. I know that Barry and Kate are very excited and have done a lot of hard work with their team, and I say Mussy to them. Mussy.
Mussy, Rihanna, it's you're such a valued member of the Aboriginal Steering Committee, providing much needed wisdom and experience that we've just benefited from so profoundly, and are excited to continue to benefit from. Some housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar, as you may have heard, is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the HELP YouTube channel when it is ready. At the bottom of your screen, you will notice both a Q&A button. You might notice as well the chat feature, which has been disabled. If you have questions as you listen, please type the questions into the Q&A feature. We will be responding to questions throughout the webinar using this feature. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can over the course of this webinar. A little bit about HELP. In 1999, Dr. Clyde Hertzman, mentioned by Ariana, and Dr. Hillel Goldman pioneered a program of research to explore the differences that make a difference in children's early development. Dr. Hertzman understood that without high quality data and research, problems would remain unseen and no action would be taken to solve them. He envisioned a unique child development monitoring system that follows populations of children across their development, offering high quality data and research to inform actions and ensure equity from the start for all children. At HELP, our work is grounded in the understanding that children live, grow, and learn within many interconnected contexts which impact their experiences and development. At HELP, we talk about this impact being from society to cell. The models you see here provide a perspective on the various influences on children's lives. The one on the left is from HELP, and the other is from the First Nations Health Authority. From the global context, such as the current pandemic and climate change, to national and provincial policies influencing health and social systems, the economy, minimum wage, housing, healthcare, to neighborhoods and community influences, including access to services, to land, to green space, all the way through to individual level or immediate influences such as family and culture. All of these things are important to pay attention to measure, to undertake research on. Today, we're talking about data related to children in the early years. Decades of research have demonstrated that early child development is itself a social determinant of health, meaning that the quality of the experiences and the environment in which children grow and develop in the early years have long-reaching impact on their health and well-being over time and across generations. At HELP, we collect data about children's experiences and development through the Child Development Monitoring System. This is a series of questionnaires that gather information from different perspectives on children from pre-kindergarten through to grade 11. The Toddler Development Instrument, or TDI, and the Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, or CHEQ, are questionnaires that are completed by parents or caregivers that gather information about children's early experiences and the context that they are growing up in. The Early Development Instrument, or EDI, is completed by kindergarten teachers and looks at children's skills and competencies and developmental health of children in the classrooms. The Middle Years Development Instrument, or MDI, and the Youth Development Instrument, or YDI, are completed by students themselves, adding the child's perspective. MDI can be collected in grades 4 through 8 and YDI in grade 11. The focus for both tools is on children's experiences inside and outside of school and assets in their lives. On a final note, the YDI was developed and is being implemented by Dr. Hasina Samji, who has affiliations with HELP, SFU, and BC-CDC. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Kate and Barry to take us through our findings today.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you, Elder Rihanna, for opening the session in a good way this morning. My name is Kate Bume. I'm a senior knowledge broker with the Knowledge to Action team here at HELP. And just a bit about me, I have a background in social work and spent over a decade working with families with young children. So I have a particular fondness for this data about young children from HELP. And this morning, I'm here with my colleague, Barry. Will you introduce yourself, Barry?
Sure. Hello. Yes, I'm Barry Four. I'm a long-term member of the HELP family, going back over 20 years, just about. And I'm a research associate at HELP and a kind of a research methodologist. I've been involved with all these tools and look forward to letting you know our latest results.
Great. So Barry and I are going to bounce back and forth for the first half of this webinar. And I'm going to start us off just looking at the outline here with a brief overview of the Early Development, or EDI, Wave 8 BC data trends, very brief, as that will set the stage for introducing the Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, or the CHEQ. And then Barry and I will provide some highlights from the CHEQ data collected this fall, 2022, and some trends in the data over the last 4 years. And then finally, Barry will showcase some of the research analysis to date with both CHEQ data and then some exciting research linking CHEQ and EDI data together. We'll have a chance for some Q&A along the way. Please do put your questions in the Q&A as we go, and then we'll wrap up. So today we're focused on the CHEQ, but want to open just talking a bit about CHEQ and EDI together. So the foundation of the monitoring system is the Early Development Instrument, EDI, and it has been collected across BC for 20 years. So school districts across the province are now encouraged to collect data from both the CHEQ and the EDI in the same school year. So this means that school districts are gathering, as Mariana laid out, that they're gathering the perspectives through the CHEQ of parents and caregivers at the start of the school year about their child's early experiences in their context prior to starting school. And then the teacher's perspective on the developmental health of that same group of children through the EDI in February of the school year, of that same school year. So this not only provides valuable data for school districts, their community and health partners, but also allows us to link the data for research purposes. Today, we're going to talk about data over the last 4 years, and unlike many jurisdictions across Canada, BC did manage to keep schools open for all but a few weeks during this extraordinary period. Not only keeping schools open, but school districts partnered with us to collect EDI, CHEQ, and other monitoring system data about the health and well-being of children in BC during this really important time to capture those experiences. So we certainly want to start our presentation by saying a huge thank you to those of you on the call rather, that are our education partners and our health and community colleagues that worked really hard to make this happen. And we also want to take a moment to thank the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions for supporting the CHEQ through funding it over the 3-year period. So just starting with the EDI, and we'll add a link in the chat to the recently released EDI Wave 8 provincial summary. So if you're new to the EDI or want more info, you can do some investigating on your own. But Wave 8 data was collected between 2019 and 2022. And what you're seeing on the screen here is the trend line for the percentage of children who are vulnerable on one or more of the 5 scales that the EDI collects data about. And then the trend from Wave 2 collected 2004 to 7 to Wave 8. And what you can see is that over the long term, in Wave 2, 29.9% of children were vulnerable on one or more scales of the EDI. And we've seen a meaningful increase in that vulnerability rate up to Wave 8, where it's now 32.9% of children. So 1 in 3 children arriving at kindergarten vulnerable in one or more of those 5 important areas of development that are important to their future success in their school years and beyond. And here's the overall provincial picture of that vulnerable on one or more scale, now across the province by school district. So this is a heat map. The darker the red, the higher the vulnerability rate is being represented. And then the lighter the pink, the lower the rate. And what stands out immediately from this map is that there continues to be significant disparity in vulnerability rates across the province. In fact, at the school district level, we know that range is, we have school districts with vulnerability rates as low as 22%, but as high as 72%. And that range is even greater when you get down to the neighborhood level. So neighborhoods as low as 13% and as high as 72%. So in terms of that variability, we do know that family and neighborhood socioeconomic status is part of the story in terms of why we see those disparities in rates. This graph shows the relationship between quintiles on the HELP SES index that was developed by Dr. Barry Forer and vulnerability rates for Wave 8 in BC, and showing that there is a gradient in terms of outcomes. So children living in families with lower SES socioeconomic status are more likely to have higher rates of vulnerability than those living in higher SES families, with a 15 percentage point difference between the lowest and the highest. And essentially what we're showing here is that the barriers and challenges that are faced by families living with lower incomes, whether those are struggles to meet basic needs, access to safe and stable housing, finding appropriate childcare, that these stressors can impact children's early experiences and development. So while EDI data have provided us with really important information about the trends and patterns in child development across the province and across time, there really has been little systematic data collected on the early experiences and the context of children prior to starting school at the population level. And this is really the gap that CHEQ is aiming to fill, and to maybe help us explain why do we see that variability that we see across the province. So some quick CHEQ basics. As mentioned, CHEQ is completed by parents and caregivers at the start of the school year in September. I just got to clear my throat once. Thank you. It's completed online. It can be done at school or at home. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. And at this point, we have translations available in simplified Chinese and Punjabi. Otherwise, it is an English questionnaire. Nope. See if I can get the next slide going. So this slide is showing the domains measured by the CHEQ. And the CHEQ was developed based on decades of research about the importance of early experiences. And in fact, which early experiences support health and well-being of children, and in consultation with experts, with community stakeholders, teachers, and parents. And you can see the alignment here with CHEQ domains and the 5 EDI scales for those of you that know those 5 scales. So here CHEQ is looking at physical health and well-being, so things like healthcare connection, sleep and nutrition, language and cognition, so early numeracy and literacy skills, social and emotional well-being, so experiences with connecting to peers, talking about emotion, screen time, children's experiences in early learning and care, so childcare and other preschool opportunities, and then community and context, so things like parent perception of neighborhood safety, how frequently the child moved, and support networks. So I'm going to turn it over to Barry.
Right, thanks, Kate. Yeah, so this is just another kind of way of showing what Kate has already been talking about in terms of the CHEQ and the EDI. And this is kind of our conceptual model about what we have to work with now that we have quite a bit of CHEQ data. The child development side on the right, as you can see, is about the competencies. That's the EDI side of things. CHEQ provides information about the daily experiences of children and families, and goes farther back to the more upstream social determinants of health, which we know lead to those daily experiences and are and through the combination of the two lead to child development differences. So we will be looking at different aspects of these three things, starting off with a real focus specifically on the daily experiences of children and families, both for the most recent CHEQ data in 2022 and trends over time. And then we'll look at other kinds of combinations of those three parts of the conceptual model. In 2022, we had 19 school districts take part across the whole province, some rural, some urban, and it's been different project participation in different years, but in the most recent year, we had 19 school districts representing 4,700 parents and caregivers, over half of all the potential parents and caregivers who could have filled out the EDI, the CHEQ, excuse me, filled it out. Although there was a lot of range from one school district to another, and this is part of our challenge to get this participation rate up as high as possible, particularly in places that are new to CHEQ. And over the 4 years of our most recent CHEQ data, we've had a lot of stability in terms of how the CHEQ has been asked and scaling out to a certain degree, even during a time of COVID. And now we have about 15,000 completed CHEQ surveys in those 4 years. They represent a little less than half of the school districts in the province. But amongst those 28 school districts where we do have CHEQ surveys over those 4 years, we have 7 school districts that did it in all 4 years. And that's a lovely, happy thing, because it actually gives us a kind of a core of consistency over those 4 years that allows us to kind of look at trends over time. The fact that there are different school districts in the different years makes it difficult to look at trends over time. But the fact that we have 7 school districts that took part in these 4 years gives us an opportunity. And we are, hoping to have province-wide coverage in the next couple of years, and that will really help us understand going forward things around trends over time. But I think we'll have a bit of a COVID emphasis on this first go through about trends over time. And I'll turn it back over to Kate.
Great. So we're going to dig into some data now. And there's so much data on the CHEQ. So we're giving you, even though it's going to feel like a lot, it's still just some of the data available. So starting with physical health and well-being. So on the CHEQ, we ask if the child visited a healthcare professional in the last year. And you can see here, these are some slides from the report itself, that 93% of parents and caregivers responded, yes, their child did see a healthcare provider. And then on the right side is a list of the type of professionals. So a dentist topping the charts here at 79% in 2022.
Right, and I'm going to handle the trends over time. We're going to kind of go back and forth. These are the 6 different types of healthcare professionals that people were asked about in terms of whether they had any visits in the previous year. And what you can kind of see over time here are some interesting trends. You can see that, of course, doctors and dentists being the ones that the parents visit the most, although, optometrists and audio and public health nurses to some degree. You can see that that had been a drop over the four years before COVID and during COVID in terms of family doctor visits. Which are starting to recover now, and on the dentist side, more consistency, not as steep of a drop, but we're now at a point as in 2022, as Kate has said, where more families have visited their dentist for their child than their family doctor.
So here we see a pie graph for one of the CHEQ composite measures. This is about physical activity, and a composite is when we combine responses to a number of questions. In this case, about children's typical weekly experiences in organized activities, so swimming lessons, gymnastics, soccer, and unorganized activities, so riding a bike, attending a drop-in program. And then the total time spent doing physical activity is combined and categorized based on the Canadian activity guidelines for children into the percentage of children that have few, some, or many experiences in these areas. And so for 2022, you can see 66% of parents and caregivers said that their child had many experiences, meaning that they met the at least 60 minutes of energetic physical activity recommended per day.
Great. And looking over time, we see a decline in the percentage of families that had these good many experiences from 69% down to 57% in 2021, with some recovery after that. And just to say, this looks suspiciously like something that might be related to some of the restrictions around physical activity that would be related to the COVID pandemic. Although we don't like to talk about cause and effect in our data, we talk about associations, but there seems to be a strong association between the kind of natural history of COVID in the last 4 years and physical activity.
Although, Barry, we were talking about how, for many families, the outdoors was like the saving grace. At least we can be outdoors all together. So, and the other thing that we know happened, at least in the 2021 summer, was that there was quite a few wildfires and a heat dome and other things that might have impacted outdoor time, although, of course, not causation, but another factor to consider.
Yeah.
Great. So the CHEQ asked about sleep, and one of the questions it asked about is, does this child face challenges when going to sleep at night? And you can see, look at that, the vast majority of parents, 78%, saying that yes, their child has a challenge going to sleep. And then on the right-hand side, the type of challenges mentioned, so not wanting to sleep alone, difficulty falling asleep, nightmares, etc. So we know that sleep is important for growing children, and there are recommendations for the amount of sleep children should get a night, with preschoolers being between 10 and 13 hours. What's interesting is that while most parents here said 78% said they had a challenge going to sleep, only 12% of parents and caregivers reported on the CHEQ in 2022 that their child was getting less than that recommendation. So struggling to go to sleep, but still most getting the amount of sleep that's recommended.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You're right. Something around 90% of kids are still getting the recommended hours of sleep. But in terms of sleep challenges, what we can see is that there hasn't been that much of a change over the 4 years. It's still a lot of children with sleep challenges, but maybe this is one area where what has been going on over those 4 years has had less of an effect on the experiences of families around sleep.
Maybe not for the parents, but maybe for the kids.
Mm-hmm.
So the CHEQ asks if if the child experienced any stressful events in the past year. You can see in 2022, 56% of parents and caregivers reported yes, that their child experienced some kind of stressful event. And then the types of stressful events listed there on the right-hand side. And look, COVID-19, so we're 3 years in, it's still listed as the top stressful event. But then a number of others, like moving to a new community, birth of a sibling, illness, etc.
Right, and again, with all the caveats around differences in participation rates and coverage for the 4 years, we do seem to see a bit of a general increase in the percentage of children with stressful events in that previous year, from 46% up to 56%.
So the CHEQ asks a few questions about children's social experiences, and we know that the research suggests that children with strong social skills in kindergarten are more likely to thrive as adults. So on the CHEQ, we ask, how often has this child been around children other than their siblings? How often have they had a close friendship with a child around the same age? And then here we see one of those composite measures, this time for peer experiences. So summarizing those questions about frequency of experience with other kids. And then in 2022, 40% of parents and caregivers said that their child had many experiences. So almost always or often having a close friend and spending time around children most or every day.
Right, that 40% you can see on the right hand side here for 2022, and what you can tell in terms of having many peer experiences, that 40% is kind of a recovery of what happened after 2019, where it dropped all the way from 43% down to 31%. And again, strong index of suspicion that has something to do with the restrictions around being able to have peer experiences during COVID.
Now on to screen time. So the CHEQ asks about the children's experience with screen time, the amount they spend watching alone, with others, using screen for educational purposes. So here we're seeing screen time alone, and that 45% of parents and caregivers reported that their child had 1 or more hours of screen time per day. There are some recommendations for screen time for 2 to 5-year-olds, which is 1 hour or less in a day. We know this is a hot topic, particularly during the pandemic, when screens were very valuable in terms of socializing with friends, visits with families, education, childcare support, speaking as a parent working from home. But at the same time, we are concerned about how much screen time children are getting in a day.
Right, and again, in terms of in this case, this is spending at least 1 hour per day alone on a screen over those 4 years. Interestingly enough, we don't see a lot of a trend over time, but I will give a bit of a heads up that doesn't mean that all families have the same percentages. It might have something to do with some characteristics of those families that we gather on CHEQ, and so hang on for something about that later on.
Little teaser.
Yeah.
The CHEQ also asks about outdoor play. So here we see some responses to the question about the frequency that the child played outdoors every week, with 69% of parents and caregivers reporting that their child plays outdoors, 6 or every day.
Right, and that is very much like the things we've been seeing so far, where we think COVID may have some influence. That there's been a drop over those 4 years that has started to recover in terms of the percentage of children who are playing 6 or 7 days per week.
CHEQ also asks about community activities that children and families are participating in. And this is the list of activities that we ask about. It's quite a few. And then we ask about the frequency that they participate in these activities, along with any barriers to accessing these programs. So a lot of data on this slide, but what we're seeing here is the top 6 community activities for families when their child was 3 to 5 years old, and that they participated in these activities at least a few times per month. And the point we're trying to make is that aside from parks and playgrounds, where you can see basically everybody's hitting a park or a playground, that when you look across the years for the other ones, you see a general trend of decline. So public library and story time in 2019, 81%, went a little bit up and then went quite a bit down. Community centers, we didn't ask this in 2019, but you can see this decline and then a little bit of a bounce up. Strong Start, we see a decline. Art and music, we see a decline. So again, assuming that this is partly due to pandemic restrictions, we know there were closures and things were not able to open up right away, but essentially highlighting here that children are arriving in kindergarten with less experience in these programs in general. So these activities rather involve experiences around other kids. They involve routines. They're run by adults other than family members. So, kids are coming into kindergarten without having that kind of practice in environments like this. And certainly anecdotally, we've heard from our school district partners that kindergarten has been a challenge over the last couple of years in terms of getting kids settled down into routines and such. We also ask about barriers to participating, and we see here that 59% of parents and caregivers reported, yes, they had a barrier to participating in the program they'd like to, with the number one barrier reported being availability of space, but then hours the program operates. And here again, 2022 fall, and COVID-19 is one of the top 3 barriers to why people aren't accessing programs in the last 6 months. To you.
Yeah, I'll take it away. Yeah. So one question around community context that we ask on CHEQ is about how often the family has accessed community food services, things like food banks or school breakfast programs, community kitchens, and so on. And I think what's interesting here is how low a percentage we're getting over time, as opposed to the trend over time. I think this kind of highlights a couple of things, and I'm not sure which is bigger or smaller, but one might have to do with the sensitivity of questions like this, as important as it is, as well as some issues about who chooses not to answer, to do the check in the first place. You'll see later on there are again more likelihood of some subgroups of parents who are going to do the check and others not as likely. And I think that shows up in this particular slide about accessing community food services.
And we should point out that when parents complete a check, they know some of the questions are going to go to the school because the school is able to access that information about their child, but some are on a private section. So this is one of those questions where it's clearly said, this is not released to the school, but still a sensitive question just to ask at any time. So now on to childcare. The check asks if the child has been in a childcare arrangement other than parental care. And we can see here in 2022, 67% of parents and caregivers said yes, their child was in a parental or in a care arrangement. And then the types of care are listed there on the right. So licensed.
Sorry, just say that we do ask for three time periods in the child's life from an infant, toddler, and preschool age, and this is these are the results for preschool age.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And so you can see 49% license say that they access licensed childcare centers in terms of childcare, but then we have all the various options that are available to parents listed there. And then we ask about barriers to accessing childcare. And we can see the vast majority, 90% of parents and caregivers say they've experienced a barrier accessing childcare. Now, this question we ask in general, we don't put a kind of age frame around it. So this could be that a parent experienced, they may well be in quality childcare right when we ask this question, but they have experienced barriers in the past. So it's a bit of a broad question, but the vast majority of parents saying, yes, they have a barrier, with the top one being the availability of space in terms of a barrier, second cost, and then hours the program operates.
Yeah, and sorry, just say that, amongst all the barriers questions that we ask on CHEQ, I think this is by far the one where having barriers is the norm as opposed to the exception. Yeah.
Yes. And this certainly speaks to the need out there. And we know that there's a ton happening in BC and across the country in terms of childcare right now. So BC moving to universal childcare. We know there's growing numbers of $10 a day pilot sites across the province. We know that the Ministry of Education is now the Ministry of Education and Child Care, and getting more involved into various early learning opportunities in the province. And this slide is showing some of those examples of the types of early learning happening in school districts. And we've certainly heard from our school district partners that CHEQ data can be very useful in supporting this work, because it represents that shared group of children, the group that people share in terms of the early years in the school system. So having the data available to talk about how do we move forward with childcare with all the change that's happening at the moment. And then finally, we have some specific questions on the CHEQ about the impact of the pandemic on experiences. So we're asking parents, did the pandemic impact? And then you'll see some examples. So we recently released a report summarizing the data from just these questions. We call it a CHEQ rapid report. And so we've done it for a couple of years. This last year, we looked at comparing the responses to parents and caregivers that completed a check in 2021 to those parents that completed one in 2022. And just to give you a bit of a snapshot, the check asks if the pandemic impacted experiences like access to consistent childcare. So we can see in 2021, 41% said, yes, I had much less access to consistent childcare. That went down in 2022, but still 38% saying the pandemic impacted childcare. Ooh, I'm giving you a previous, no, back, there we are. We asked, do parents and caregivers feel connected to families and friends? We see 64% said that they felt less or much less connected in 2021, and that still 47%, almost half, are feeling less connected. Household income, was it impacted by the pandemic? So 25% saying yes, by the pandemic it decreased. In 2020, we still see 20% of families saying that the pandemic had an impact on their income. This is an interesting one in terms of access to healthy food. So in 2021, 5% said they had less access to healthy food. In 2022, that actually went up to 10%. Maybe a result of inflation, et cetera, but interesting change over time there, or difference in the way that parents reported. And then we asked about parent stress levels, and we can see that in 2021, parents, 42% of their stress levels were high or very high as a result of the pandemic in the last 6 months, and still 38% are reporting that kind of level of stress. So I think we're going to pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. I'm going to call on Maddie Spenrath, who is a director of core projects at HELP, to say, I don't think there's any questions in the Q&A just yet, but maybe her voice will come on from beyond.
Hello, thanks, Kate and Barry. There is an easy question just to start off. If anyone's curious whether the links that Agata is sharing out will be available after the webinar, certainly we can circulate those. Don't feel like you have to open them. And another question, almost more of a kind of a validation of what you were speaking around the question on food security, and even just knowing the last one you put around access to healthy foods. Just noting that in the early years poverty report, 1 in 8 children are living in poverty, and wondering how that aligns with whether this is a sensitive question for families, and perhaps whether we're capturing those families more in the 1 in 8. I'll just, not so much a question, but if you wanted to respond to that.
I would suspect that we are our families that are participating in CHEQ so far, who would be classified as being in poverty or low income, are probably underrepresented in our CHEQ results. It's the thing is, you need to, it's things like the poverty report that help us to understand what the population looks like, so we can compare our sample to that population and see who's missing. Also, we are just getting things like census and tax filer information that also will help us identify where we have to kind of redouble our efforts in terms of participation in CHEQ, where there are some issues around sensitivity or interest. But yeah, go ahead.
One of the challenges of, I think, putting the CHEQ up against the EDI is that we have such strong participation rates in the EDI. With most teachers that are asked will participate, most kids participate. We're talking about 88% in wave 8, and that was down from wave 7, was something in the 90s. So, gathering information from parents and caregivers is a lot harder to get them to be willing to have the time, all of the factors, to have the languages all covered that we would need in a province as diverse as BC. So just to be very transparent that it's a challenge to get parents and caregivers, and certainly the ones that we would say are less likely to, or maybe struggle with school systems more, might be even less inclined to complete a check that the school district is putting out there. So we're recognizing this is a barrier, and trying to problem solve ways to get as many parents on board as possible.
Thank you. And thanks so much, everyone. We are getting a few questions coming in, and some of them I might answer and hold to the end of the session. So I'll just put a couple more out there in the meantime. Can we speak about equity seeking groups? Are we collecting data on equity seeking groups? Barry, do you want to take that one?
I'll let Kate start it off, maybe, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, I think I sort of started that with my last comments there, that it is a challenge if you think about parents that live with lower incomes or racialized groups, Indigenous families. It's that kind of coverage is potentially more challenging to get depending on the school districts that we're rolling out to. So one of the things is that we went to big districts in the years when we weren't able. So a lot of the urban districts participated during a time when parents weren't allowed even to come into the schools. So we've also had to manage that over the last 4 years where it's only this school year that parents could come in, and that helps make people feel more comfortable doing anything, being connected to the school, filling out a questionnaire. So we definitely have had some system barriers in the last little bit, and we hope to get better at it. We are collecting some. I think when we look at our demographics, we know that there is some coverage across the spectrum of folks, but we definitely need to do we could do more in terms of recruiting, and it's just even around language, being able to translate our surveys. Yeah, Barry, do you have more to say on that?
No, I think it's a work in progress, as you're saying, Kate. I mean, we're at the stage now with EDI, for instance, where we can look at our data in a very disaggregated way and be able to really understand, to the extent that we have information on the EDI, about some of the differences across different equity-seeking groups, and we're getting there with CHEQ, you know, but it's work in progress. It'll take a little while. We'll have a whole province of data collection in the next couple of years, and I think that'll be a good opportunity to see what's possible.
I guess another thing to mention is that we have tried to do a better job of making sure that people can find their identity in our CHEQ in all of our surveys, and particularly around Indigenous identity and languages spoken and all of that. We are really trying to make a concerted effort so that people, if they do approach the CHEQ, that they see themselves represented in that way. So there's some ways that we are doing our best to make it as comfortable as possible for folks to complete it.
Thank you. And a few other great questions, and some of them are really leading into the next part of the session. So I'll leave them for either being answered in the next part of the session, and then we can revisit them at the end. But I will give one more before we move on. Can you speak about the reliability of parent self-report, Barry?
Yeah, well, I think well, compared to what other ways of gathering information, I might say, I think it's great to have the parents' voices here. You know, it's really important, in fact, throughout our whole monitoring system, that we, as much as possible, gather reports directly from the source, as opposed, you know, like the MDI, we actually asked the students, you know, once they're old enough in grade 4 to be able to handle a whole survey. There will always be, I think, some issues around social desirability and so on in filling out these things, and that is something for us to kind of try to get a better sense of.
But
Go ahead.
Can I hop in there? Because I think we have done on the CHEQ, like one thing is different than, say, the EDI. It's not, we're not asking parents to assess their child's development or their competencies or their skills. On the CHEQ, it really is about how much time, what's the frequency of your child's experiences. And in many questions, we have the option of saying, not yet, I haven't done this yet. So trying again to make the type of questions that we're asking more comfortable for parents to just feel like they're reporting on what's been available to me. What have I actually had access to? And it's less about a judgment on parenting as it is frequency that they've been able to. We also ask about barriers. So there is that comfort around, I haven't been able to access, also it's not in my community. That kind of storytelling is able to be shown through the CHEQ. But yes, parents are having to say how much screen time and how much healthy foods. So whether or not everybody's exactly accurate on that, that's a hard one to know. But again, it's more about your frequency of experience than assessing the child. It's not at all about assessing the child, just to say that last bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an ongoing issue to make it really plain and clear that these are about context and experiences, and not about judgment, not about what's better or worse, but just again to try to address what the state of families are around the different parts of the province, to hopefully push the child outcomes like from the EDI in a good direction. You can tell from the conceptual model that EDI scores are not going to change on their own. They're going to change when the social determinants and the experiences change. So, yeah.
Thank you. And thanks everyone out there for the great questions. We
Yeah.
will have more time at the end, so we'll pull up some more of these questions. Back over to you, Kate and Barry.
Thanks, Maddie. So I'm going to turn my camera off and we're going to leave it over to Barry.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So as promised, I'm going to spend some time looking at not just the CHEQ scores, but on daily experiences, but also the other two parts of the conceptual model. Not the EDI by itself. We've already Kate showed some of those results, and but this is about where CHEQ kind of fits in. And so one of the ways that CHEQ fits in is it measures something about the social determinants, the socioeconomic characteristics of families, as well as their daily experiences. So if we go to the next slide, you could see, yeah, thank you. That, and this will maybe, if you actually look at these are the 5 different composites that we actually calculate for CHEQ. We've talked about a couple of them: physical activity and peer experiences. This shows all of them. But what they all kind of share to one degree or another is that if you look at any one of them, and let's look at physical activity since we already did. If you kind of look at the percentage of children with many experiences, I think the desirable number of experiences, for physical activity, you see a gradient by household income. We've divided household income into 4 different categories. And you see a very obvious gradient where there's a big difference from those who are in the lowest household income to the highest. And this is going to be a very common theme, household income just being one of a number of different kinds of social determinants that we can actually get from CHEQ. Go to the next one. Another one that we can look at in terms of social determinants is something about education. And in this case, it's the education of the parent who's filling out the CHEQ. We actually ask about the education of both parents, and then it gets into some complicated combinations. So this is just the simplest kind of way of looking at it. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's probably mostly the mothers as opposed to the fathers, but I'm not sure the exact percentage. But again, what you see across the 5 composites is mostly a clear educational gradient, where the 3 categories here are those responding parents who have not done any post-secondary education, those who have done some and maybe achieved a certificate or diploma, but no bachelor's, master's, or PhD, and then this last group, which are those that have a degree. So you see that for most of these composites, there is a gradient there. For physical activity, just having some post-secondary education seems to be the same as whether you have a degree or not, based on our data so far. Go to the next one, please. Going back to screen time. Here we're looking at screen time in terms of 4 categories. I remember more than 1 hour is kind of at the place where we are starting to worry that it's too much screen time for children of that age. And if you look across the household income gradient there, you see that even for the more than 2 hours category, it's 8.8% for the people with the highest household income, and it increases if you go all the way down to the other end to almost 3 times as much, at 25%. So there is a household income gradient on a lot of these variables, and of course, I'm not going to show very many because that would take forever. But more often than not, we will see this, but I will show you an example of where we don't see it, which will be interesting later on. And this is the same thing on daily screen time alone by the education level of the respondent. And again, we see this gradient by education in terms of screen time, and a fair number of children. If you look at the left-hand column, over half are getting at least 1 hour per day. Okay, next, please. Okay, so let's turn instead now to kind of looking at this, at leaving out the daily experiences, but just going right from the upstream social determinants directly to the EDI scores on child development. It's kind of a weird way of looking at it, to tell you the truth, because it is the daily experiences that are the mechanisms through which a lot of the social determinants end up making a difference on child development. But it's interesting just to see what by themselves the social determinants kind of look like in terms of EDI scores. And so if we look at the next slide, what you can see right away, even though it's, oh no, I'm sorry, okay. And then we can also, also just look at the daily experiences against the child development as a way of kind of building together into this kind of overall model where we have all three considered at one time. So, okay, so we want to be able to do these things, but one thing that having the linkage, it's funny. One of the things that we have that's good about having a link between CHEQ and EDI data is it tells us more than just how many people are missing, but it tells us potentially who's missing from the CHEQ data. And so these next two slides are showing the children in the orange where for this one particular year, 2021-2022, that where they were entering kindergarten and the parents did do CHEQ, and then we got their EDI scores. The blue columns are the ones where we have their EDI scores, but the parents did not do the CHEQ. And so it's really a bit of a sense of who's missing from our data. How biased is our sample in a way? And what you can see from this graph is that there's not much of a difference between whether it's a boy or a girl in terms of whether a parent fills out CHEQ or not. But there is a big difference if the child shows up in the EDI as identified as English as a second language. We're missing a lot of those children from our CHEQ scores, obviously. That's probably the biggest area. And we don't have that many variables to check against because the EDI only asks about certain things. Special needs is another one where you can see a difference between which parents are filling out the CHEQ and which ones are not. And so that's about our sample. And because of who's missing, what you can actually look at here is how that shows up on the different scales of the EDI. And what you see here is that the people who haven't filled out CHEQ across the board have higher vulnerability rates than the ones who did. For the same group of children entering kindergarten in this year in our sample. The differences are highest, as you can see, in language and communication, and lowest in emotional maturity. But this is again the consequence of who's not in our sample, because the samples that we do have and all the results that we have are just for those people who do fill out the CHEQ. And it really, again, it emphasizes how important it is to have participation across the board. And that's, for instance, why we did the simplified Chinese and Punjabi versions of CHEQ, for instance, to try to encourage more participation from those language groups. And that's a work in progress. Okay. So if you just look at the social determinants against the EDI child development scores, what you actually see is what you probably would expect. And here we're looking at household income again. These are the 5 different scales of the EDI. And what you see is as you go from the lowest category to the highest category of household income, you see a drop, a gradient in terms of the vulnerability rate. To give an example of the scale with the highest vulnerability, emotional maturity. It goes from like about 23% down to about 12%. It's almost double as you go across the gradient. And you can see also from all of these that it's not a straight line gradient. It's a gradient that kind of where the differences between, you know, very low and low are bigger than they are between pretty good and really good, if you want to think about income that way.
And Barry, just to be clear, this is using CHEQ, parent reported income.
That's right. This is the beauty of CHEQ. It provides family level social determinants like income, where in the past, before we had CHEQ and all we had was EDI, all we could report on indicate showed a similar kind of gradient, but all those scores were at the neighborhood level, and we didn't have information at the family level. So this is like filling in the gaps in that whole kind of a model that Mariana showed at the very beginning of all the influences being important and being able to be measured. Okay, next, please. Okay, so let's focus then on the daily experiences and how they relate to developmental outcomes on a few things. Here's one on the 5 composite scores that we were talking about before, and whether families have few, some, or many of those experiences. And again, let's focus on one we already looked at, say physical activity on the left. The vulnerability rate overall, that is on 1 or more scales of the EDI, for those who have just a few, a score of a few on physical activity, have 38%, or 38% of those children are vulnerable on 1 or more scales. Those who have many, it's down to 26%. And what you see for practically all of these composites is a strong gradient in terms of vulnerability, depending on how many experiences you have. So clearly, even if we don't have everybody that we want to have in our sample, what we're seeing here is a very strong evidence that the experiences that we're collecting are some of the things that are strongly associated with outcomes for children. Okay, I know I have to go a little faster maybe. Okay, so let's keep going on. We're going to kind of try to put these together in a way where we kind of show all 3 in a kind of almost like a flipboard animation maybe. Okay, let's go down. Okay, let's go back to, remember, healthcare professionals visited. Remember we saw the results for 2022. Now, here we're just looking at, you know, I think one of our slides got hidden out, but this is just for the children for whom we have CHEQ and EDI scores, all of these things. And just to let you know, the children who did their CHEQ in 2022, last September, their EDI scores are being collected now. And in fact, you know, I think the cutoff for collecting EDI scores for this school year is just around now, at the end of February, beginning of March. So we don't have the 2022 CHEQ linked to EDI yet, but we have them for the previous 3 years. And as we go forward, we're going to end up with a lot more children for whom we have linked CHEQ and EDI, because we are more and more structuring our data collection so that CHEQ and EDI are done in the same year everywhere. Anyway, I think that slide got lost somewhere in the shuffle. Here's healthcare professionals visited. You can see what this looks like for, you know, over the 3 years where we have the linkage of CHEQ and EDI. If you go to the next one, what you see is that people who either expressed they had some barriers or not in terms of visiting healthcare professionals. And if we divide that up into those who had no barriers, which in this case is a relatively large percentage, versus those that expressed 1 or more barriers, what we see here is a clear trend by household income in terms of access to healthcare professionals. And that's what you would expect. And we can show this for other determinants as well. If we look at vulnerability rates by barriers to access, you can see what an effect having these barriers has. Again, across all the different aspects of the EDI, all 5 domains of development, we see that those who have barriers have more vulnerability. So it makes a difference, and sometimes a very big difference. Let's look at a couple of other things here. In terms of these things, remember we looked a little bit at the community activities that children have been using over each year, and what the barriers to access there were. Again, we divide up those who say that they had barriers versus those who didn't. And I know I've seen this slide many times. You've just seen it for the first time, but for something like social and emotional and physical, which makes maybe the most sense, you see that those children for whom their parents said there were 1 or more barriers to participating in local activities have higher vulnerability rates on those three scales of the EDI, and not so much on language and communication. Okay, childcare, very dear to my heart because I'm a childcare researcher person, but this is very interesting stuff and a very complicated topic. Here's something about for preschool age children, looking at childcare type in terms of 3 categories: parental only, an unlicensed type of childcare, and a licensed type of childcare. What you see here by household income is the much greater likelihood of using licensed childcare as income goes up, and the corresponding decrease in the likelihood of using parental care only for their childcare needs for their preschool age children. And if you go to the next slide, please. No. Okay. Despite the fact that there's it looked very similar. Despite the fact that there's a big household income gradient in terms of the type of care used, there's not much of a gradient in terms of the number of childcare barriers. And here we've actually not just talked about no barriers versus some barriers, because the majority, maybe the vast majority of families do express that they have had some barriers. So now we have like 3 categories of barriers here. And again, despite that, we don't see much of a household income gradient. And what this really kind of points to is how it doesn't matter how much your household income is. There are other reasons why people have barriers, and it's more of a systemic thing that affects everybody more or less equally. Maybe not 100% equally, but more or less equally. And next, please. And where that shows up in terms of vulnerability rates is also kind of interesting. Having no barriers versus 1 or 2 versus having 3 or more. We do see some small gradients in terms of vulnerability, more so on the social and emotional side than on the other scales, based on our linked data so far. During COVID too, right? You have to remember that. Okay, and down to the next one, please. Okay, is that it? Okay, we're on to questions. I hope this generates lots of questions, and I'm looking forward, as Kate is, to trying to answer them.
Right.
Come, Maddie.
I'll give people time to type in questions if they're doing so. And yes, as I mentioned, a lot of the questions were around what families are included in the data set, how is that showing up in the results, how are the early experiences being reflected in the later child development. So a lot of those are really good questions, and I hope that Barry and Kate addressed those through the most recent slides, but please share any clarifying questions here. I have a question that we're always happy to hear about that just came in. Thank you. Can you speak to off-diagonal communities? Someone's referring to a previous presentation where we identified those communities. Barry, I'll leave it to you to describe what off-diagonal communities are, and if you have anything to say around recommending policy in, oh, that's a separate question actually. Start with off-diagonal communities, Barry.
Sure. Okay, well, this is a wonderful question. I love to talk about, and cut me off in 2 minutes, please. So an off-diagonal community is one where, based on the socioeconomic index that we have at the neighborhood level. So in this case, it's neighborhood level information. When we compare the vulnerability rates at the neighborhood level with what their socioeconomic characteristics are that we get from the census and the tax filer, excuse me, there are some communities that look very much like you'd expect them to. And in fact, EDI scores by themselves are not that useful because, you know, you would probably expect, you know, a very wealthy neighborhood to have a lower vulnerability rate than a very disadvantaged neighborhood. So you have to take these things into account. We do that with our SES index at the neighborhood level, and we identify places that have unusual results. Either their vulnerability rates are a lot higher than you would expect them to be given their characteristics, or they're a lot lower. And so the question then becomes, what explains what makes them off diagonal, which is what we call them. And some people call them outliers, some people call them defying expectations, some people define them in different ways. Anyway, we know that the vulnerability rates that we see in all communities are, if you knew everything about that community, there would be no such thing as an off-diagonal community, because there's only things that we just haven't measured about that place that tell us why it looks so unusual. And so our tools, besides EDI, especially like MDI and CHEQ, help to provide the information that we can't get from census or tax filer. So what we've learned, for instance, in Revelstoke, which is a place that is a fairly average, maybe slightly above average socioeconomic community with the lowest vulnerability rates in the whole province. What we've done is we've gone in there with all of this information that they've gathered through our tools and identified what makes them different. And those are things around things like how well coordinated their early years system is. Something about how they create connections between adults and children from very early on and carry them through from the preschool age through the school system. And now we know why they're off diagonal to a larger extent than we did before. And so I think that something like CHEQ is our way of trying to understand those off-diagonal communities in a way where we don't necessarily have to go in and spend hours and hours talking with them about everything. They're providing that information about what's happening with those parents, and that will help us understand things around social capital, for instance, that we don't measure in the census. You're supposed to cut me off after 2 minutes. Okay, that's my answer.
Cut off. Thank you. And a couple of other respondents are just wanting to know more about off diagonal. We can point to some resources on the help website there. Thank you. Another question, just a small question. What would be some recommendations regarding policy in an ideal world to buffer these vulnerabilities? I direct that to Kate. Do you want to start with that one?
Oh, sure. Ideal. This is the silver bullet question. The big one we always think, oh man, this is such a hard one to answer. What would be the hot ticket items? I mean, I think the move we see going back to childcare, 90% of parents saying that they have a barrier to accessing it in some way. So we know it's necessary, and we know there's lots of moves in that direction, but it's complicated and takes time. So more on that, making sure that system rolls out in a way that creates quality and accessible childcare. I think it's those sorts of things. We know there's already been lots of strategies for starting to look at poverty reduction, and we know that over the pandemic, there was just that comment earlier about poverty numbers in BC moving from 1 in 5 all previous years to the most recent poverty report card showing that it had dropped to 1 in 8. Partly related to all the income transfers that supported families during the pandemic time, which now have ended, and we're in a complex inflationary time. So we do know those mechanisms are important, certainly when we see the gradient in terms of the relationship between family income and child development. That's one of them. And then I think it's in terms of big policy things, those are the couple that I would throw off the top. Barry, you want to throw off others?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the policy level is great because, you know, we don't ask parents about policies, but we know that, you know, beyond families, beyond neighborhoods, going into municipalities and provinces and the whole country, that's where the policy level is. And we ask questions here at HELP, and I've done some work recently on, like, why does British Columbia have 1 in 3 children vulnerable on the EDI, but Ontario only has 1 in 4? You know, there's a reason for that. There has to be a reason for that, and so of course we have data on all those things, and part of the reason for that in Ontario and British Columbia has to do with differences in housing affordability, where it's the worst in BC compared to Ontario. And I absolutely agree with Kate that the almost like the kind of federal, provincial, municipal wide kind of childcare policy landscape is at a place now where it can make a big difference. If there is enough available childcare at an affordable price that's high quality for everybody, if those investments are made, I think it would go as long a way as any other policy investment could go in terms of helping all families and children thrive. So, but I'm a bit biased.
And then I think there's, you know, the big social determinants, like continuing to move forward on truth and reconciliation, all that means, and continuing to think about how we're addressing racism and moving policies in those big picture respects, all part of the story in terms of vulnerability. But not, unfortunately, we can't say it's this, just everybody do this and it's going to be okay. We're pointing out quite a few big ticket items, but in many ways, there's been a lot of change. We did our Wave 8 webinar and we talked about the significant number of changes that have happened between Wave 7 EDI and Wave 8 in terms of government policy and investment in support of children and families. So you can watch that webinar to find out what we speak about there, but some of the same things we've referenced so far.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions too. We do have, and a couple of attendees have put in questions around, what about access? We're talking about programs, of course, it's also access, reducing barriers, and equitable access. So not so much questions, but just throwing that in there as well.
And I think if there's one thing that all your analysis highlighted, Barry, it is how important barriers are, Barry, to outcomes of children. And so, yeah, I think has always been a big topic at HELP to think about, or to encourage earlier service providers to consider what are the barriers for parents to accessing. And certainly the pandemic didn't help. And what we have heard from a lot of, again, anecdotally, but from early years providers, is that it's been hard to get parents back into these programs and services and I'm talking about drop-in services and things where you're supporting children's play and emotional development and physical activity, but that, you know, especially for those children now, 3 years born in a pandemic, that didn't have some of the things that I know I relied on as a parent, where word of mouth to get to certain programs, that I was hanging out with a pack of other young parents and we could know where to go. And all of those things were disrupted during the pandemic. So trying to get parents to know what's actually out there, that I think is a barrier, a kind of newer barrier around how do we let parents know what is even there, because many of those things were disrupted. And so getting parents back in to stuff. And then I think was there a question, Maddie, about did you say early intervention? No, okay, I misheard. Go ahead, Barry.
No, I think that's all fantastic. I would just add that you know, one of the things that usually shows up as one of the top 3 barriers is not only just availability, but also something about flexible hours, around flexible hours of providing those resources or activities. Maybe that's also a consequence of COVID, is that, you know, people need things not always at the same time as much as they used to, and that's another area, certainly for childcare, that's going to be an interesting challenge to try to create a system that not only is, you know, affordable, available, and so on, but available when it's needed, you know.
Yes. And again, part of the point of the CHEQ is to be able to gather this kind of information at the community level, so you're able to see what in my community are parents identifying as the barriers, because it may be quite different from one place to the next.
Yes, just noting there's a few questions here around childcare kind of policy and rollout. So both those families with potentially that have children with special needs and the additional barriers they face, about how the rollout of 10-a-day childcare, how is that being targeted to lower income families, as well as the salaries of the childcare workers themselves. So knowing that help is not directly involved in any kind of childcare policy, but if you, I know we've touched on this a little bit, but anything else on there, a lot of interest from the audience here.
Yeah, and what we should do is host a webinar with some of our ministry partners to talk with us about these conversations, because agreed, those are key ones, and there's a lot of effort happening right now, but it's complicated, especially in terms of the rollout of childcare and the family connections hubs in terms of children with extra support needs.
Yeah, you know, I think this is a theme probably worth bringing up, because there's always this tension between the fact that, you know, we know that there are many different things around barriers and experiences that are important to having optimal outcomes for children, and you can't really understand any one of them unless you usually ask a number of questions that kind of get at some of the nuances of those things. Childcare probably has a few more nuances than most, but we can't make parents sit down and fill out an 1.5 hour questionnaire to go into that kind of detail. So that's the challenge too, is that we want to cover all of the important areas and realize that we can only ask the most important questions, and sometimes not even all the important questions. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn about how to build on that to, for instance, provide more information to policymakers around childcare, for instance. We would love to be able to use something like CHEQ to inform whether the childcare policies that BC is putting out are meeting their stated goals or not.
Thank you. I'll go to a great question that just came in. What can we do as community members to engage more people in CHEQ completion? Here's the call out. We'd love some support. Kate, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and one of the things that we mentioned during the presentation is that having schools be able to let parents come into the schools is really a big part, because we do encourage school districts that are participating in the CHEQ to host some kind of a session for parents to help them come into the school, to see that the school is interested in collecting this data, to provide tablets and the tech available so that parents can complete the CHEQ at the school if they want to. So that's a great thing. Community providers can reach out to their school districts if you to say, can we help our school district collect this data, that you want that data. I think that's a big part of the story, is helping to tell the story about why this data is useful, what services and community partners and health partners would use the data for to support ensuring that there's the programs and services that parents and caregivers need at the community level, so that parents understand why they're being asked to do this. We know that for many school districts that have been collecting CHEQ over time, they use it on many levels. One is just to get to know the families, because they get an individual level. They're able to see their classroom snapshots, to get to know the families that are coming into their classrooms. And so teachers and school administrators being able to communicate to parents, this is really useful information. This is how we use it to support your family and your child. I think that kind of communication is really helpful. And service providers that can say to their school districts, we're willing to help by hosting something, or how can we ensure that the families that we're working with, especially if you work with more vulnerable families, perhaps it's doing some of that very relational based work. It's walking a certain families over to the school to actually fill out the questionnaire, or ensuring that there's translation available for that service. So any of those pieces are part of it.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a great question to end on. I'll type a few answers to the outstanding questions, and we have 5 minutes left. Over to you, Kate.
Great, thank you. Great questions, lots of good questions. So to wrap up, we're coming to a last couple of slides here. We wanted to talk about just actually exactly this question around how, so we've talked a lot about what the data trends show, but how is the data actually being used? And just mentioned some of those things that teachers, schools, school and district administrators talk about, using the data to get to know the incoming families, using the data to support primary teams to work together, to learn about who are those new kindergarten kids in our class and their families. It might help a teacher, for example, look if they're wondering about a child's behavior in their class, they can look at that to find out more about, did that child attend childcare? Have they had experiences with other peers? Things like that. They can note lower areas of experience in their classroom to see, are there classroom activities or curriculum opportunities that we could build on? So for example, perhaps it's including more outdoor play in the way that in the curriculum, or including social and emotional learning opportunities. We know that at the district level that our data from CHEQ, from EDI, from MDI is used to help in terms of decision-making at the school and district level, to share the data with community partners so that folks can think about their shared children and families together, and what community initiatives might help to address some of the issues that come up in the data. And as certainly already mentioned too, is around childcare planning. So these are the kids that the school district and the community share. How do we think about what needs to happen in terms of childcare moving forward? At the provincial level, we know there's been a ton of interest in from both government and from coalitions across the province around what is the impact of the pandemic on children and families. So that data has been a hot topic. We know that CHEQ data has also been included in the strategic document, A Pathway to Hope, from the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. And part of the reason they're supporting through funding the CHEQ to roll out province-wide, to ensure that we're collecting data about what are those early experiences, and how do those early experiences impact the social and emotional development of children, to think about early mental health and well-being. So CHEQ data is being used in many interesting ways. We have a newish website where we are collecting stories about impact, and about how the data across the child development monitoring system are being used in different ways, from the provincial government level down to communities and neighborhoods. And we'd love to hear from you if you're a partner on this call and you've been using these data in interesting ways in your community. Let us know, because we have the opportunity to highlight stories. Folks are always curious to hear what others are using the data to do or to inform. So in terms of what's next, we've already talked about, we have a real push for next year, rolling out the CHEQ to all school districts that haven't participated in CHEQ data collection yet. So we hope to have another big batch of school districts involved next year. We are also going to be releasing, this is very exciting, an EDI data dashboard. This is going to be an online tool that allows viewers to explore EDI data at a variety of different boundaries. So from the traditional, when we've released our reports at the community and neighborhood level EDI data, but this data dashboard will allow folks to look through a variety of boundaries, like health authority boundaries and MCFD boundaries. So we would really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter if you're not already signed up, because that's where you'll get the first news about when this is released. And I think that link will be in the chat. It's coming very soon. And then finally, in terms of CHEQ reports. So when a school district participates in CHEQ, they have private reports at the classroom, school, and school district level. We do release publicly. We've had project level or all participating districts, the kind of data that we showed today. We have project level reports across these years available on our website. And we have had, we've released the CHEQ COVID rapid reports for a couple of years, also available on our website. But what is coming soon, and for the first time ever, is school district and neighborhood reports. So from those school districts that participate in the CHEQ, we will be releasing their reports so that folks can access it publicly, barring our blanking on the word. What's the word, Barry? Our conditions around what we feel is appropriate to release in terms of participation rates. And I will note, once we do that, and that should be sometime this month, that CHEQ reports will be available. What you're going to be able to do is go onto our website, click on reports, and then you can search by your location to see what data is available for you. Is it CHEQ, EDI, MDI? That's what we will have on our website. And then again, shared in the link will be, if you're interested, if your district has participated in the YDI, we have a link to that YDI page that will be shared to see what reports are available there. Any caveats you want to say, Barry, about reports on our website?
No, I just encourage people to have a look, and the more that you can see what's going on in your places, the more we're going to get to having wide-scale participation across the whole province.
Yes. So thank you all. Realizing we're right at time now. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Thank you for the great questions. We'll follow up with an email and all the links that we shared during this session, along with a link to the recording of the webinar. To stay informed, join our newsletter. And that's great. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, big shout out to all the helpers and others that UBCIT that helped to make this webinar possible today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.